Yeah, so just to begin, first of all, I just want to acknowledge all the people who were involved in putting this exhibition together. This is very much a collaborative effort. So we had a group of 5 students involved in this exhibition. They're right up here on the wall for you to see. So Adam and Ariel, Tulia, Mira, and Anna. I think Anna's here. Okay, do we have Tulia here as well? Yes? She's coming. Okay, so that's good. We'll have a night. Well, we'll get a few of you here, and at the very end of this discussion, I'm going to allow a little bit of room for any of the students involved in this exhibition to entertain some questions or talk about works if they would like. But I want to treat this really as a kind of roundtable discussion, because the first thing I thought of doing with this talk, when I began to realize that we might have fairly large numbers coming into this space, was how to manage that, what would be the best thing to do. So I'm going to treat it a little bit like a kind of seminar discussion, and I thought I would actually begin by posing a couple of questions to you to get your feedback on this. The idea of museums and art galleries. We're all here right now in this gallery. You come here to hear me speak and to come and see the exhibition. But the first question I would actually pose to you is, why do we do this? Why do we come to Why do we have museums? Why do we come to them to see things? Of what value is it? That's the first question I'm going to ask you. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, we're all here today, and I think it's always useful to ponder that. So what do you think? Why do we have museums? Yes? You can come forward.
Perspective. Memories aren't that great, so if we see an image or an artifact, this is a great way to preserve that visually, physically, and in some cases, both.
Okay, so you're thinking of it really not just in terms of an aesthetic experience, but you're thinking in terms of a kind of pedagogical experience. You learn something, right? And we preserve, we hold on to it for posterity, these objects and so forth. And I think we all sort of intuitively understand that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, in terms of context, getting a number of things together in one space that might not have been separately.
Yes, so if we put these things together into a space as we're doing here, then our inclination is to read them comparatively, right? To look at these objects and to start thinking about how they relate to one another, which opens up avenues for meaning, right? So I think this is really quite interesting, because if we stop and think about museums and galleries, we recognize that it's not just about the aesthetic appreciation of things, the pure pleasure of looking or viewing, but we expect to gain something more from that. And the reason why I'm asking this question is because ultimately this exhibition here has to do with the idea of collecting in the first place. If we go back to the early days of museums and galleries, we can look back to the period of the Renaissance when they first began. This exhibition is sort of centered on the idea of what would really be classified as a museum, the idea of the Wunderkammer, which is a cabinet of wonders or curiosities, which in the Renaissance and in the age of the Baroque would have configured works of art as well as visual media, prints, drawings, paintings, and maps of the type that you see here on the walls, along with natural history objects too. So we have the narwhal tusks, for instance, here. We have the nautilus shell over on the far side, the insects contained in the Van Veen room right here in the center, which have been generously donated by the biology department. And we even have a flea in there, courtesy of Marvin Gunderman and his dog. We also have some red coral around the side, which I'll take you to in just a few moments. These things have been incorporated into this exhibition to give the sense, to give a bit of a feel for the idea of the Wunderkammer. And remember that these things were pitted side by side. They were put into these collections so that you could read them visually against one another. Why do you suppose that is? I'm just going to ask another question of you here. And if we think about these natural history objects, like the narwhal tusks that are right here in front of me, why do you suppose, not only in the Renaissance, but in the Baroque as well, which is what this exhibition focuses on, why do you suppose people would be interested in not only collecting these things, but placing them alongside works of art for viewing? Any thoughts on that? What the motivation might be? No? Well, one thing that impressed people or resonated for people in the Renaissance and the Baroque was that these objects ultimately were seen as things that were wondrous. Of course, the narwhal tusks, for instance, were at one time regarded as, well, can anybody guess where people thought they came from? Unicorns, right? Yes, and I stumbled across, actually courtesy of a friend of mine, stumbled across a recipe, a late medieval recipe on how to prepare unicorn, which I have to look at a little bit more closely because I have no idea who came up with this idea and how they ever tested it in a kitchen. Very interesting. But suffice to say, by the time you get to the age of the 17th century, the age of the Baroque, objects such as these, the narwhal tusks, which were still very highly prized, were recognized by many at that point as not coming from this mythical creature of the unicorn, but they had discovered the narwhal and knew where it came from. So there was an interest in collecting these things, not just for the curiosity, but because they could learn more about the world. What happens, however, with some of these objects is that they are pitted in these collections against works of art so that you can read them comparatively to see what it is that nature can produce, the wonders that nature can produce, and on the other hand, the wonders that human beings can produce. So if you think about these Wunderkammers, these cabinets of curiosities as early museums, where they brought in these natural history objects along with works of art, it was a way also of determining what it was possible for human beings to do and how we see ourselves in relation to what nature produces. So if it's possible to walk you over a little bit, I'm just going to turn over this way towards the nautilus shell. So I'm just going to part the Red Seas here, not that I'm comparing myself to Moses in any way, okay? And just draw your attention to this. If you look at the nautilus shell that we have on display here, it gives you an example of something that's taken from nature. And we have these images on the wall here, two images at the top showing these nautilus shell cups, both of which are in the Royal Ontario Museum. Hopefully, if you want to come around, you can absolutely come around the side here. And both of these cups are from the Royal Ontario Museum. We've received permission from them to reproduce the images here. And what you can see in these nautilus shell cups, and there's a narwhal tusk cup down here at the bottom, to be read comparatively with the narwhal tusks over there, and a coconut cup, right? These are the sort of strange wonders that entered these collections, but in these cases, they have all been transformed by the goldsmith's art or the silversmith's art, so that human beings have become involved in taking these wondrous things from nature that piqued curiosity and transform them into something that no longer exists in nature but has been embellished by human invention. So you can see how the relationship between art and nature became particularly prominent in these collections and resonant ultimately. I'm going to try and walk you around to this piece of red coral, which the red coral has been incorporated here in the collection. Students of mine who've been through my Baroque course or in the fourth year seminar where I've been dealing with Baroque wonders will recognize all too well this thing here, because the red coral was seen as something particularly important to have in your collection and always to be posed alongside works of art. In fact, there are paintings from the 17th century that show the interior rooms of collections of these wonder cabinets, where you will see works of art alongside this little piece right here, the red coral. There's a descriptor that's on the wall just over here to give you a bit of information about the red coral, which was particularly prominent. One of the reasons why was because it was seen as something that was ultimately metamorphic. Part of what made this such a wondrous thing in its time was the fact that it seemed to transform. When you have it in the water, the coral growing in the water, when you go into the water, is soft and pliable, rather like a plant. But when you remove it from the water, it calcifies and hardens. It becomes like stone, like mineral. And this was recognized certainly from antiquity onwards. And by the 17th century, this natural wonder became something essential to incorporate into your collection because it was seen to have these metamorphic powers. And one of the things about the collection that I think is particularly resonant also is that people who collected works of art wanted to imagine themselves as having the same kind of power that we see vested in these things in nature. In other words, a patron or a collector who built up a museum and amassed these wonders and works of art all together, created this miniature universe, would want to see himself, or in some cases herself, because there were women who also collected in both the Renaissance and the Baroque, would imagine themselves as being, well, rather like this wonder of nature, having the metamorphic power to shape the world around themselves, but also to shape their own identity at will. So they sort of tried to appropriate that power for themselves. Now, one of the underlying themes of the exhibition that I wanted to try and get to was this idea of ownership or possession. Because if you look at the subtitle for the exhibition, Visualizing Ownership in the Age of the Baroque, the motivation behind this exhibition actually stems from a particular concern that I've addressed a number of times in my courses in the past, which has to do with this, not just what museums and collecting was all about, but has to do also with the way that visual culture acted as a kind of mitigating vehicle to reconcile ideologies in the 17th century. And as you look around this room, in this space, you'll realize very quickly that much of the work that we have on display comes from the Netherlands. Much of this focuses on Dutch work, not all of it, but much of it. And there's a particular reason for that. Well, there are two reasons. One has to do with the fact that the holdings here at the McMaster Museum of Art are particularly strong, when it comes to Baroque, are particularly strong in the area of Dutch material, so logically this is the pool that we were drawing from. But also it conveniently worked out because the Netherlands, of course, in the 17th century was a society that was undergoing rapid change. If you go back to the 16th century, to the time of the Renaissance, in fact we can go back to the time when Michelangelo was working in Rome on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. At the same time he was doing this, in Northern Europe, you have an Augustinian monk by the name of Martin Luther, who was doing what? Any art history, or sorry, any historians here? Yes? Okay. Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, right? I always say this, just to clarify, but he is very important too, absolutely. But if we're talking about Renaissance and Martin Luther, what did this person do? Why is his name so famous? Does anybody know? He reformed the church. How did he reform the church? What exactly do you mean by that, or what did he do? I won't single you out. Yeah, I won't single you out if you're not too. Yes. Yeah, Martin Luther was one of a number of people who had issues with the Catholic Church at the time. We're talking about a period around about 1517, when he actually writes up a series of theses, 95 theses, which are protestations against the Catholic Church, because he and many of his countrymen perceive the Catholic Church as being inherently corrupt at this point in time. So he writes these 95 theses and launches a protest that really sparks a kind of wave of reform in the northern part of Europe against the Catholic Church, and you have with that the rise of Protestantism. A schism forms within the Church, and the Catholic Church in its power and authority is then placed on very shaky ground at that stage. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because it's very important, of course, for the history of the Netherlands. But what happens with the rise of Protestantism is it's born out of a kind of rebellion against the perceived corruptions of the Catholic Church. It is rooted in these ethical and moral concerns. So you can imagine in Dutch society, with the rise of Protestantism, that morality was extremely important. What also happens in the 17th century, now the Protestant Reformation has started to sort of grow and develop in the 16th century. By the time we get to the 17th century, what also happens in the Netherlands? Does anybody know what changes or what happens in that in that part of the world, I should say, the 7 states of the Netherlands? Anything else that happens? Well, they achieve independence from the Spaniards. In Spain being predominantly Catholic, this was extremely important for the Protestant Dutch to be able to free themselves, to liberate themselves from Spanish dominion. Flanders to the South Netherlands, remains under Spanish dominion, but the North Netherlands achieves independence. And with that, there's a dramatic change in society, because you have this very Protestant society with these very strong morals, but now that it's independent, it can engage in trade at its own will. And what happens? Because they're a seafaring nation, they're right there, they're very skilled at shipbuilding, they start to move out across the globe, and they engage in trade in a vigorous way. By 1602, you have the formation of the VOC, which is the Dutch East India Company, a very powerful multinational corporation. This is the age of the first multinational corporations. Only 2 years prior to that, Britain had done the same. It had formed its own East India Company, and they'd moved into the remote parts of the world in order to engage in trade. One of the main things they were concerned with is exactly what we have over there on that little table. Spices. I just heard somebody say it. Spices, yes. Spices such as nutmeg, peppercorns, right? Mace, which is the husk from the nutmeg, cloves. These things were like gold. These commodities were highly prized. A lot of money stood on this trade. A lot was resting on this. And unfortunately, and this is a rather dark chapter in the history of the West, of Europe, this desire to own these commodities and to engage in trade and to amass wealth very often, more often than not, resulted in rather unfortunate events. Violent conflicts, many people lost their lives during this period. And you can understand that for these corporations and for the citizens in these nations, particularly in the Netherlands, this raised a number of conflicting issues, right? What happens when you live in a society that has been born out of these very staunch moralizing imperatives, and at the same time is now accumulating wealth, untold wealth, from engaging in trade that conflicts with those morals? How do you reconcile the two? And that was ultimately the fundamental issue beneath this exhibition. The exhibition, the idea from the start was to look at museums, to look at collecting practice, to look at visual culture, and to see how it somehow factored into this very interesting problematic issue. The need within society, particularly within Dutch society in the 17th century, to reconcile these conflicting belief systems, these conflicting ideas. Did visual culture, did museums and collecting somehow play a role? And since museums and collecting are predicated on the idea of possessing, of owning, of bringing objects into your collection, of buying works of art, hanging them on your wall, making them your own, the impulse is very similar to what you would do with trade. All of this, by the way, coincides with the rise of an art market in the Netherlands, which grew very rapidly. In fact, artists producing works of this type could be so specialized that they could actually produce images only of oysters. It was possible in the 17th century to be a Dutch painter and to make a living by simply painting pictures of oysters. Can you imagine that? There are people who specialized in paintings of pretzels. They did nothing else because there was a huge demand for this type of work. You could specialize in it, and the money was there. Independently wealthy merchants, not members of the church, not kings and queens, but middle-class, wealthy middle-class citizens who could afford these works. And there was this market that was opening up. So all of these things seem very, very intriguing, and this is essentially how the exhibition sort of came into being out of this network of issues. The contention behind the exhibition that you're looking at right now is that every work that you see in here reflects that desire to procure images in a visual culture that will somehow serve to mitigate these conflicting ideologies, these conflicting belief systems. Now we might ask, how does that actually happen? So how do you get from A to B? I want to suggest we can work with this painting here. We could do it with any number of works here. In fact, the exhibition really is based upon a selection of works that conform to three categories: people, places, and things. Those are the sort of three categories. So we'll deal with things here. We'll deal with a still life. This is particularly convenient, the oyster painting, because of the fact that it's so sumptuous. It's very easy to look at this and to see how it might factor into the idea of desire, of wanting something, right? As you look at this painting, what is your general reading of it? What does it do to you? How does it act upon you? How do you respond to it? Sorry? Makes you hungry, of course, right? Because it appeals not just to your eyes, it appeals to your taste buds, right? And that's exactly what the artist wants to do. To go beyond just the sense of sight, to embrace all the senses if possible. On the other hand, as you look at it, you see the oysters and you think to yourself, well, what's the symbolism here? Because oysters were very much a sexual symbol. They were associated with sexual indulgence, and they were used as a symbol in visual art in the Netherlands in the 17th century for this very purpose. And they're also associated with gustatory indulgence, right? The desire to want to eat, and to eat a lot, to indulge yourself. What is rather interesting about this is that the painting is rendered in such a precious way that it feels tangible. You feel as if you can reach in and actually pick one of those oysters out and eat it, right? The artist has gone to great lengths to do this. There's a preciousness about the rendition. There's a preciousness to the object itself. I'm not going to caress the painting because the alarm will probably go off, but I'll give you the general impression. Because remember, In the 17th century, in these collections, people would actually hold these works. They wouldn't just be content to place them on a wall. They would be handling them. They might even run their fingers across the surface. Okay? People are in shock when they hear that today, because we don't do that in museums, but they did at one time. They had their hands all over this work. So it was very much a kind of tactile experience, but it was also about the preciousness of what you're dealing with here. As you look at the painting, you think about not just the image here, but you look at the frame, the entire work, the way it's beautifully rendered, becomes a precious object, rather like a commodity. It is a commodity. It was part of the art market. But it bodies forth some ideas that do something else for you. It doesn't just appeal to your sense of taste. It doesn't just seem visually appealing. It's offering a moralizing message at the same time. How do you think it might be offering a moralizing message? Yeah, Danielle?
Well, there's like a limit. You cannot actually eat the oysters, or like a restraint that you must force yourself to confront those issues that you appreciate it, but you cannot have it.
Right, okay. What happens if you reach in to try and grab an oyster? Okay, it's not like Willy Wonka where you can reach into the TV and take out that chocolate bar. Your hand is going to hit the painting and that's it. It's over, right? There's the frustration of having encountered the fact that it's not really there. It's just an illusion. And suddenly in the process, you're reminded of your desire, your want, your need. You're reminded of the fact that this is a very human compulsion, but it stops you dead in your tracks at the same time. You can't have access to it. It's frustrating. It denies what it offers at the same moment. And that process makes you stop for a moment and think about who you are, the choices you make in life, what your wants and needs are. The suggestion here is that, and as you reflect also upon the symbolism here, the fact that it is overtly referencing the idea of sexual indulgence and of gustatory indulgence itself, it's offering a potential moralizing message. It's going to make you, well, at least it's offering the possibility of making you a better person for having experienced that work of art, because you stand in front of it and you begin to reflect upon yourself. It leads to self-reflection. And therein lies the sense of improvement, the sense that it offers you something back. Now, interestingly enough, Martin Luther, remember our old friend Martin Luther? We go back to him back in the early days of Protestantism. Martin Luther encountered the same problem we're talking about. What happens when you are a very moral kind of person, but at the same time, being human, you want to acquire things, you want to indulge yourself? How do you reconcile these things? Martin Luther recognized this, and he also knew, even in the 16th century, he could see where things were going. He could see that trade was going to grow and that people would engage in it. This is where the economy was ultimately going to go. He needed to provide some guidance. He wrote a sermon on the issue of trade and usury. And very interestingly, in that sermon, he actually addresses this issue quite directly. And he says that trade itself and indulgence can be inherently bad. They can be. But there is a possibility that you can be a good Christian and lead a moral life and still engage in trade. Here's the caveat. How can that be? If the things that you engage in trading with, if you are involved in trade, if those things are beneficial not only to you, but somehow benefit society at large, they offer something back, then it is good, it is right to engage in trade. You can do it with a clear conscience and remain Christian. So that brings us to this work here. Here is an object that is part of that trade, the art market of the 17th century. It can be seen as something indulgent, the desire to have something that is aesthetically pretty or beautiful to place on your wall, to possess and own it, but it offers something back to you at the same time. One could look at this work and say, not only does it satisfy my immediate needs, my desire to want, to own, to possess, but it's right to do so, because this work is ultimately making me a better person at the same time. And if I add this work to my collection, my growing collection of works, let's imagine we're all collectors right now, and this is our collection in this room. Because in one sense we are, right? We're all affiliated in some way with the McMaster Museum of Art, and the McMaster Museum of Art is a collection. We have all these works in our collection. Why? Because we will benefit from them? Exactly, because they offer something back to us. There isn't that much distance obtained between us and the 17th century collector in our impulses to want to have these things. But we recognize, just as the 17th century collector did, and just as Martin Luther understood, that the commodities that we have, in this case the works of art, are somehow beneficial to us, and that we can rest with a clear conscience because it is right to have them. By being here in this room, hopefully, and I do say hopefully, you will leave this room being better people for the experience of having looked at these works of art and of having thought about them. It will change you in some way. This is what Martin Luther had in mind, though I don't suggest he was thinking specifically of works of art or even objects of this type, but the principle can certainly be applied, can easily be applied to this. So this is, I think, a rather interesting thing. Visual culture, as we can see here, invested in these objects and the collecting practices of the 17th century, in a sense, underscore or validate the very idea of possession or ownership. And in that sense, you can see how this visual culture plays into this issue of reconciling these conflicting belief systems. Owning, possessing, collecting works of art and amassing them in museum collections was a way of partaking of the bringing together of these two conflicting systems and allowing yourself to reconcile them. Do you see what I mean by that? Now, I think it's particularly resonant for us today. One of the other motivating issues behind the exhibition was that it was felt from the very start that somehow exploring this particular issue through the objects and the works that you see in this collection, and hopefully leading visitors to the exhibition to think about this, would also lead to some self-reflection on our own society, how these things still apply to us today. And that leads us to the here and now. Because in our own society, even today, we deal with conflicting ideologies and belief systems. We know, for instance, that the way of life that we enjoy here in North America, in Canada, at this moment in history, is a pretty good way of life. And we know how we live. We know what needs to be done in order for us to enjoy the standard of living that we enjoy. We know that when we buy low-cost items at a store, that strategies have been used to bring those costs down. This is the reason why we have sweatshops and so forth around the world, right? And I would suggest to you that it's something that we are all aware of and we think about from time to time. How do we reconcile our way of life, the things that we recognize we have that make our life good? How do we reconcile that with our own ethical and moral concerns about the welfare of others, those who essentially have to make the sacrifices for us to live as we do? In many ways, we are confronted with the same problems that 17th century society was confronted with. I've used the Netherlands as an example here, but the problems are very similar. And I suggest to you that as we look at this exhibition and consider some of the things we've been talking about, that as you walk away from the exhibition, thinking about these issues, you might also reflect upon how these same issues apply today. In what ways do we, in our current society, use visual culture as a mitigating vehicle to reconcile our own conflicting belief systems? Are there ways that we do it? And I'm not suggesting to you that I have the answers to that question right now, but I leave it as an open-ended question for you to think about. And that's where I'm going to end. Okay? Thank you very much.